The day my father was buried, my wife didn't cry. She stood at the graveside in her good coat, the navy one she wore to church, and I watched her eyes move across the cemetery like she was calculating something. I noticed it, but I told myself I was wrong. Grief does strange things to people. I had enough of my own to carry. Dad had lived alone in the same house outside Sudbury for 31 years after my mother passed. A two-story brick place on a gravel road, the kind that gets muddy in April and stays that way until June. He'd bought it in 1978 when he was still working the mines, and he never left. My brother got the cottage up on Manitoulin. I got the house. My wife found out at the lawyer's office. She sat very still the entire reading. On the drive home she said, "The cottage is worth at least $400,000. Did you know that?" I said, "I didn't." She said, "And that house of his probably has black mold and a furnace from the 90s. She wasn't wrong about the furnace. I'm 63 years old. I retired 2 years ago from 38 years in municipal water management. I am not a flashy man. I have never been a flashy man. I drive a 2011 Silverado with rust around the wheel wells, and I like it fine. My wife has always found this embarrassing in ways she stopped trying to hide about 10 years ago. The night of the funeral, she slept on her side of the bed facing the wall, and I lay there listening to the furnace kick on in our house, and I thought about my father and the way he used to hand me tools before I knew the names of them, trusting that I'd figure out what to do. I fell asleep around 3. She gave it 2 weeks before she brought it up properly. We were eating dinner chicken she'd made with that lemon herb seasoning she buys at Costco, and she set down her fork and said, "We need to talk about what you're going to do with the property." I said I wasn't sure yet. She said, "Because your brother got the cottage, and that's already rented out most of the summer, and you're sitting on a money pit." I said, "Dad had only been gone 2 weeks." She picked her fork back up and didn't say anything else that night. I drove up to Sudbury the following Saturday alone. The house smelled like him, like the particular combination of instant coffee and whatever soap he'd been buying since 1987, and the faint mineral smell that older houses get in northern Ontario when winter starts to loosen its grip. I stood in the front hallway for a while with my coat still on. The linoleum in the kitchen had lifted at one corner. The curtains in the living room were the same ones he'd had when I was in high school. I went through the house room by room the way you do, looking at a person's life in objects. His reading glasses folded on the nightstand. A crossword puzzle book, half finished. A photograph of my mother on the dresser that I had to turn away from. I found the file folder in the bottom drawer of his desk. Dad was meticulous about paper. I don't know where he learned it, but he kept every document he'd ever signed in manila folders, sorted by year going back to 1971. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just going through things. The folder I pulled was labeled in his handwriting. Utility Agreement, Crown Land Access, 1989. I sat down in his desk chair and I read it. I am not a lawyer, but I spent 4 decades working in municipal infrastructure, and I know what easements are. I know what a utility corridor agreement looks like. What I was reading was a 35-year-old agreement between my father and a provincial crown corporation, granting access across the back portion of his property for a buried hydro transmission line. The agreement had a renewal clause. It renewed automatically every 10 years unless either party gave written notice of termination within 6 months of the renewal date. I flipped to the back page. The last renewal had been signed in 2019. The next window would open in 2029. The annual access fee in the original 1989 agreement was $4,000. But there was a clause I had to read 3 times to make sure I understood. The fee adjusted every 10 years, at renewal based on a formula tied to the Ontario Consumer Price Index, plus a fixed percentage tied to provincial hydro corridor rates. I found the 2009 renewal paperwork in the same folder. The fee had gone to $11,200. The 2019 renewal wasn't in the folder. I looked through every drawer. I found it eventually in a shoe box in the closet, tucked under some old Christmas cards, the way my father sometimes put things when he meant to file them and forgot. The 2019 annual access fee was $29,400. I sat in that chair for a long time. The line had been running since 1989. The provincial authority had been making deposits directly into my father's account. I checked his bank statements, which he had also kept, sorted by year, in a binder on the second shelf. There it was, every March. Regular as the seasons. For 35 years, my father had been collecting a payment that he had apparently never mentioned to anyone, or, if he had, I had not been paying attention. $29,400 a year, deposited into an account I hadn't known existed. I drove back to our house in Ottawa that night, and I did not tell my wife what I had found. I want to be honest about why. I've thought about it a lot since. I told myself it was because I needed to understand it fully before I could explain it. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I had just watched her do arithmetic at my father's graveside, and I needed some time with this thing before I let it become something we argued about. My brother called the following Tuesday. He wanted to know if I was planning to sell. Because realistically, he said, that place needs work, and you're not going to want to be driving up to Sudbury every time something goes wrong. He was already renting the cottage through a property management company, and he'd asked them to look at Dad's house as a potential addition to their portfolio. He said they'd assessed it at $165, maybe $170. He knew a developer who might take it off my hands. I said I'd think about it. What I actually did was call a woman I'd worked with at the municipality, someone who'd moved over to the provincial infrastructure side about 15 years ago. I told her I'd come across an old utility corridor agreement, and I wanted to understand what it was worth in today's market. I didn't tell her whose it was. She said she'd look into it and get back to me. She called me 4 days later. She said corridor access agreements for buried hydro transmission lines in northern Ontario had become significantly more valuable in the last decade due to grid expansion pressures. She said agreements with the renewal structure I described, with CPI plus corridor rate adjustments, were the kind of thing that a provincial authority might want to buy out, rather than continue renewing, because the rate trajectory made them increasingly expensive over time. She said a buyout offer, if one were made, could be in the range of 4 to 6 times the current annual value, depending on the remaining term and usage projections. I thanked her and sat in my truck in the Canadian Tire parking lot for about 20 minutes doing math on my phone. My wife had been sleeping with her back to me since the night of the funeral. Not every night, but most. She'd started spending more time talking to my brother and his wife at family dinners, the 4 of them at one end of the table while I cleared plates. I noticed. I'm not good at confrontation. I have spent a long time in my marriage, being the person who waits for the weather to change. That spring I drove up to Sudbury 6 weekends in a row. Told my wife I was dealing with the estate, which was true. I hired a plumber to fix the pipes in the upstairs bathroom. I replaced the furnace. I paid to have the exterior painted, a color very close to what it had already been, because I didn't want it to look like somebody else's house. My brother called again in June. He said the developer was still interested. He said the property management people had revised their estimate up slightly, 175, maybe 180, given the work I'd done. He said, "You should think about whether you want to be a landlord at your age. It's a headache." He said this in the tone of someone who was trying to help me. I said I'd think about it. What I was actually doing was talking to a lawyer, not a family friend, not someone who knew anyone we knew. A real estate solicitor in Sudbury who specialized in crown land and utility agreements. I brought the whole file folder. I brought the shoebox. I brought the bank statements. She spread everything across her desk and went through it page by page, and then she looked up and said, "Do you understand what you have here?" I said I thought I was starting to. She explained it to me in plain language. The agreement was legally valid, had been renewed properly 3 times. And the property I'd inherited included all the rights and obligations of the original signatory, which meant the provincial authority would be making that annual deposit to my account, or whatever account I designated, for the foreseeable future. The next renewal window in 2029 would almost certainly produce a higher rate given current hydro corridor pressures in the region. She said it wasn't unreasonable to project $42,000 to $48,000 annually by the time the next renewal came through. She said there was a possibility the provincial authority might approach me about a buyout at some point, as they'd been doing with a number of older corridor agreements in the region. If they did, she said, she would recommend I take my time before deciding anything. I drove home that evening, and I thought about my father, about how he never talked about money, how he just did the work, paid attention to the paperwork, filed things where he could find them. He'd been collecting $29,000 a year, and he'd never said a word. Not because he was secretive, because to him it was just part of how things worked. You read the agreement, you kept the documents, you let it run. He'd grown up during a time when the Ontario government was running transmission lines all over the north, and landowners who signed easement agreements were considered to have gotten a fair deal. Some of them had. Some of them had gotten a quietly extraordinary deal because the rates they'd negotiated compounded in ways nobody thought to predict. My father had been patient. My father had been patient. That was all. Patient and careful with paper. My wife asked me in August if I'd made a decision about the house. We were sitting on the back deck, the end of a warm evening, and she had that particular quality of stillness that I knew meant she'd been thinking about it for a while before bringing it up. She said, "Your brother thinks you should sell. I think he's probably right," she said. "We could use the money. With your pension and my retirement coming up, we could do a lot with 180. She said, "I don't know why you're dragging your feet on this." I looked at her for a moment. She was looking at the garden. I said, "I'm not dragging my feet. I've been doing research." She said, "Research on what? It's a house, not a project." I said, "There's a utility agreement on the property. A hydro corridor easement. It pays an annual fee." She turned to look at me. "How much?" I said, $29,400 a year, indexed for inflation and corridor rates. Next renewal in 2029. She was quiet. I said, "I'm keeping the house." She said, "What does that mean, keeping it?" I said it meant I wasn't selling. I said I was renting the house to a retired teacher from Chelmsford who needed a place near her daughter, and the rent covered the property tax and maintenance, and the hydro corridor payment came in every March, and I was going to keep the agreement running until I had reason to do otherwise. She asked me when I had figured all this out. I said, "About a week after the funeral." She was quiet again for longer this time. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about it. I tried to be honest. I said, "Because the day we buried him you were calculating what the cottage was worth before we got back to the car. And I needed to figure this out for myself first." She didn't say anything else that night. The following months were not easy in our house. She was angry, which I understood. I had kept something from her, which was true. But I also knew that if I had walked in the door 2 days after the funeral and told her about the agreement, the conversation would have been about what we were going to do with the money, and it would have turned into something that didn't belong to me anymore. My father had spent 35 years with a shoebox in a closet and never made it anyone else's business. I needed a few weeks to understand what I'd inherited before I shared it. She came around eventually, not all at once, and not without some difficult conversations that I won't go into here. But she came around. My brother did not come around as quickly. He had already told the developer I was considering offers. When I called to tell him I was keeping the property, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So you're going to be a landlord?" I said yes. He said, "Okay." He said it in the way that meant several things he wasn't going to say out loud. The retired teacher moved in that November. She sends me a text once a month with the e-transfer, and sometimes she includes a photo of the garden she's started growing in the backyard. Tomatoes, mostly. Some herbs. My father would have liked that. Last March the deposit came in. $29,400, same as it had been coming in since 2019. I transferred a portion to a TFSA I opened for this purpose. The rest went into a joint account. My wife used some of it to fix the roof on our house in Ottawa, which had been needing it for 2 years. One evening not long after, she said, "Your father was smarter than I gave him credit for." She said it quietly, not looking at me, folding laundry at the end of the bed. I said yes, he was. She said I was awful that autumn. I said she had been struggling, which was also true. I don't hold it against her entirely. I don't hold my brother's calls entirely against him either. People see what's in front of them. A rundown house on a gravel road outside Sudbury looks like a liability. It looks like a problem to be solved. You have to be willing to sit in a dead man's desk chair and read through 30 years of manila folders before you understand what it actually is. My father taught me that without ever sitting me down to explain it. He taught me by doing it himself, quietly, for 3 decades, filing everything where he could find it, letting the agreement run, never making a fuss about any of it. The 2029 renewal window will open in about 5 years. My lawyer and I have already talked through what to expect. The provincial authority has been in contact with some of the other corridor agreement holders in the region. There may be a buyout conversation at some point. If there is, I'm going to take my time. I drive up to Sudbury every couple of months now. I walk through the house, check in with my tenant, make sure things are in order. Last fall, I fixed the corner of the linoleum in the kitchen that had been lifting since before my father died. I found the exact same pattern at a flooring supply place in Barrie. It doesn't match perfectly. The rest of the floor is 30 years older, but it's close enough that you wouldn't notice unless you knew to look. I think my father would have done the same thing. Close enough. File it away. Let it run.